Hey, this is Darren from PostgresCourse.com. And today, what I wanted to share is the solution to a pretty simple problem that happens pretty frequently. It's not really a problem, it's just better understanding by design what a PG dump does. A common question we get is, hey, why aren't my users showing up when I use a PG dump for a backup? So just to illustrate the problem, I'm going to demonstrate it first. Over here on my default cluster, this machine is called Node 1. And I have a cluster running on the standard port of 5432. So on this cluster, I have a database called Organ. If I were to log into Organ, look at a table named employees, then there is some data. So let's say I want to do a backup of that database. Well, what might I experience? I just want to demonstrate one other thing on this node. You'll notice I have several users that have been created, even a couple that belong to groups. So I have this enterprise group with Data, Picard, and Riker. I have a number of DBA users. One DBA belongs to the DB creator use group and so on. If I list my databases, you can see that this Organ database I'm working with is actually owned by the DBA user. So what is the potential problem that people often encounter? Let's go back out and let's just execute a quick PG dump to make a backup of this database. All right, so I'll make a backup of the Organ database using the PG dump utility. Let's see what that backup file looks like. The cool thing about just the default text settings for a PG dump is that that file is human readable. So as I go through and I see what Postgres will do when it attempts to restore this database, you can see I have all my settings being made here for the client up front. Then I get into some DDL to create extensions and then to create a table. Notice this statement here. It's going to give ownership of the employees table to the DBA user. So let's attempt to create that and restore that on a cluster where the DBA user doesn't exist. I have another cluster set up on this machine. It's running on port 5434. If I do a listing, then it's just like a brand new cluster. All I've ever done here is run initdb, so it's brand new and empty. It just has those default Postgres databases that you see there. Same thing for my users and groups. There's nothing there but the Postgres user. So if I were to follow the standard procedure to restore a PG dump, it'll be something like this. I'll create a database named Organ, connect to Organ, and then let's do an import. I'm going to import that file temp organ.sql. And that, I think that import messed up my my search path. So then there's my employees table, right? And the ownership is a Postgres user. You'll recall that that really should be the DBA user. And we can see the error that occurred to indicate, hey, that DBA user doesn't even exist. So it really makes sense that people would ask the question, well, how do I get my users in a PG dump? The answer is, well, you basically don't. I'm going to go back to the Postgres database. I'm going to drop the database Organ, and we're going to start again. All right. The solution is to do a PG dump all. So I'm going to just run the PG dump all utility against the cluster. And I'm going to send the output to a file called temp all.sql. What is the difference between PG dump all and PG dump? Well, PG dump all is actually pretty interesting because if we take a look at the file generated there, you'll notice at the very top, instead of saying it's a Postgres database dump, it's Postgres database cluster dump, meaning that for this instance of Postgres, everything got dumped. Don't be confused by the term cluster. That's Postgres terminology for a database cluster, which is essentially one single instance of Postgres. All right. So we see the same settings taking place. There's a whole bunch of users being created. Those users being created include their hashed passwords. You can even see the roles that can't log in which function as groups, and altering those users and groups so that here, adding the membership so that the users belong to the correct groups. Then Postgres goes ahead and it will create the databases, and then one at a time it'll connect to any database I have here in this database dump. So I could forward search through this file and I could look for any connect statement, and it's going to connect to Baltimore. And it's going to connect to a database named Darren, a database named Films, a database named Oregon. Previously, remember we just updated or we just ran a dump on the Oregon database. Now this is a PG dump all, and it's giving me everything. But really, all I'm really interested in is the stuff at the top, these users I wanted. So how can I get just the users? Actually, pretty simple. I'm going to run that PG dump all command. I'm going to add one simple flag, which is -G. -G option stands for global objects. In the Postgres environment, the users and groups don't reside in any one particular database. Instead, they reside at the cluster level. So that's why we have to use the PG dump all utility, because it dumps all the contents from a cluster. If I want to modify its behavior to not dump the actual data, but just to give me the global objects, I can run a command like that. And then when I take a look at all.sql, what do I have? I have my users, my global objects. And then that's it. There's no data after that. So if I want to restore that now to my other cluster, I can first import the temp all.sql file. Again, error that the Postgres user already exists. That's not a big deal. Now you can see I have all that structure again, including group ownership for all those users. And now if I do create database Oregon, I connect to Oregon, and I import my Oregon backup now, no error occurs to show that there's any problem with the DBA user. And again, for some reason, my search path got messed up a little bit, but I'll just fix that up. Now you can see that that employees table did get correctly imported with the correct ownership. And all the data is there. So again, just to recap, if you're working with Postgres and you want to do a single database dump, your correct utility is PG dump. However, when you take a look at the beginning of a PG dump, it will start to create objects for that database. It'll assign ownership, but if these users don't exist, then you'll start to get errors. To get those users, remember, users are global objects in Postgres. That means they reside at the cluster level. So you'll need to use the PG dump all utility to dump all cluster contents. And to specifically only get the global objects, the users out of there, you can add the -G option and your backup will look something like this. Hopefully this helps when you're working with Postgres. If you want more information about how to work this in production, or if you have any questions, please put it down in the comments, like and subscribe, and I hope to see you again here on this channel or even in one of our classes.